All right, let's take a look at our first early civilization, and that's going to be Mesopotamia. All right, let's go back to Mesopotamia. We know that Mesopotamia was an urbanized society. They lived in large city-states. And this picture here is an image of what somebody thought maybe the city of Babylon with its beautiful blue tile gates might have looked like. It's a pretty big city. All right, they tended to be rectangular in shape. They also have these shop-lined streets with broad avenues. So the streets were wide enough to accommodate merchants and business and commerce. They often led to the central part of the city. Each city-state also controlled the surrounding farmland. It wasn't just a city, it was literally a city-state. People lived within the city walls, but the surrounding farmland that was around was also controlled by the city as well. In fact, without the farmland, you wouldn't be able to sustain the people living in the city. So some really good examples of cities from ancient Mesopotamia might be Babylon, Ur, Cush, and Urk. Here's an interesting recreation of what some people may have thought the city of Nineveh might have looked like. And this is the palace of Nimrod in the back. And again, on the far left, you can see there's a fairly large ziggurat. Again, it's located along the river. It's a walled city. So it kind of fits in some of the characteristics that we've already talked about. Although we don't know if this is what it actually looked like, this is an artist's conception of what they thought it might look like. Here's the actual city of Ur. This is an aerial photograph taken of an archaeological excavation. And you can see this city is sort of on an elevated area, so up on a hill. It's somewhat rectangular in shape, but you can see that it was fairly defensive and it probably had a wall going around it at one time. There's not much left of it today. That's why it's an archaeological site. But you can see that there are some major structures. In fact, there may even be a ziggurat off on the side there in the back. Okay, let's take a look at well-organized central government. The economy and the government were centralized in the city-state. And it would be based on agriculture, so both the state and the economy would be based on agricultural production of food. The crops would be collected as taxes, and then they would be redistributed to people. So again, the role of the central government here is to ensure that there's enough food to feed everybody. So people, like farmers, would grow the food. The government would collect the food in terms of tax from the people, the grain as a tax, and then they would store that tax, and then in a bad time perhaps, or maybe when people were hungry, they could redistribute that food as needed. And that would help keep the government in power, but it would also ensure that people were well fed, which is, again, one of the roles of government is to take care of the welfare needs of its people. Okay, let's take a look at complex religions. We know the Mesopotamians were polytheistic. Okay? Their gods, in fact, had human qualities. So not only did some of their gods actually appear like humans, but they also had some of the same sort of personality and sort of behavioral complexes that you might associate with human beings as well. Now, each city-state had its own god and goddesses, and so in many ways these city-states competed with each other, not just in terms of warfare, but in order of which gods that they might pray to and who might protect them in times of war or in times of trouble. They also had a belief in an afterlife, and for Mesopotamians, their afterlife was sort of a grim underworld. They really believed that people who were bad would go to a bad place. It may be a reflection of their physical and geographical environment, that they lived under harsh conditions. The weather was often bad. There was oftentimes floods from the river, and these would be interpretive signs from the gods of sort of bad things. So they believed that if you were bad and didn't do well, you could end up living in a grim afterworld afterwards. Okay, they also engaged in a series of public works. They maintained roads, so there were road systems between the city-states to facilitate trade. They also had defensive walls to protect the inhabitants of the city-states. They also had irrigation ditches for flood control. Remember, Mesopotamia means land between the two rivers, so they oftentimes flooded the land between the two rivers through irrigation systems. That helped to contribute to the productivity of the land in terms of agriculture. They also organized the construction of ziggurats, and as we'll see, ziggurats are step pyramids that are made of mud brick that are often found in most city-states. Okay, let's take a look then at job specialization. Labor was highly specialized, and what that basically means is that people had very specialized jobs. So some very particular examples would be things like architects to build ziggurats, potters to make pottery, merchants would buy and sell things via trade on their trade routes. Priests, of course, would interpret their religious beliefs and run the temples. Jewelers would create jewelry. Warriors might be obviously trained at fighting, but also how to use weapons and how to defend people. And of course, scribes were people who could read and write. They might be the priests, but they might also be record keepers as well. So in Mesopotamia, these were examples of specific jobs that people would have had that were very specialized type jobs. All right, let's take a look at art and architecture. First of all, ziggurats, as I mentioned earlier, are huge multi-step pyramids. These pyramids were often made of mud brick or local resources in the area. They're not like Egyptian pyramids that were made of stone, therefore they didn't last very long. What remains of them is basically sort of mounds of dirt as opposed to solid brick or granite that might have existed from the ancient Egyptian pyramids. Okay, most of these things were located in the center of these cities in the Mesopotamian city-states, so they would have been centrally located and visible to most people. Also, they could be used as temples, so for learning for religious beliefs. They could also be schools for learning how to write and read, perhaps if you were a priest. And they could also be used for storage of tax-collected crops. So as the well-organized central government collected grains from people, they had to store them someplace. There's a possibility that these grains might have been stored at the local ziggurat. In some cases, marketplaces might have also been located at the base or nearby the local ziggurat, since it was located in the center of the city. So these buildings actually played a very important role in the city. They defined their religious beliefs, they may have also been used as institutions for learning, and they also may have been used for economic reasons as well. Here's an example of the ziggurat at Ur, okay, the city of Ur. And you can see it's a pretty big structure. It's located right here in the center of the picture. Okay, and you can see that the actual city itself was fairly large. You can see its outline going around that area. And today it's a modern archaeological site, but the ziggurat itself has actually been partially reconstructed. Here's what it might have looked like if it was reconstructed. You can see the outline in green. And this actually was a photograph of this structure from about the 1920s. If we were to look at it from an artist's perspective, this is what it may have looked like when it was actually finished. So it would have been a fairly large and impressive structure. In fact, this is what it looks like today. This photograph was taken fairly recently in the 1990s or maybe the early 2000s. But if you were to go there today, you would see this. Most of this reconstruction took place under the rule of Saddam Hussein, who felt that he was sort of an inheritor of the great Mesopotamian kingdoms. And so he tried to have this thing rebuilt to sort of show how great and powerful he actually was. As you can see, it's never really been finished. Okay, here's just a picture of another famous building that we know existed in Mesopotamia. It's called the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. We don't really know what it looked like, but there are references to the Bible. But I thought this was an interesting picture because it almost looks like a ziggurat. But again, you can see the importance of water as a means of transportation. The fact that it's a hanging garden reflects agriculture, perhaps. But this is an artist's concept. We also know that art played a huge role in Mesopotamian society. Their craftsmen were very skilled. On the left, we have what appears to be sort of a crown with some earrings sculpted in gold, which is pretty good craftsmanship. And on the right is some sort of a deity or god from the Mesopotamian religious belief system. Again, both of these things are highly decorative, highly skilled. It would have required some jeweler or some kind of craftsman with a lot of skill to be able to create this kind of artwork. Okay, writing is also important. We know that they had a writing system known as cuneiform, and cuneiform is a writing system of pictographs on clay tablets. So they would write their script, their sort of pictographic script, onto wet clay tablets using a pointed stylus reed. They basically put it into the wet clay tablet, and then after the tablet dried, it would become sort of a solid written record. There were 700 symbols in all, at least 700 that we can now decipher and read. They're basically used for record keeping. There's not a lot of literature, but there is some. So actually, if we take a look at this here, you can actually see where the evolution of the cuneiform writing comes from. It originated with tokens, so literally with solid pieces of probably clay or little token pieces that people exchanged. And you can see, if I go to this first level here, here's a token. And then this is the pictographic form of that token. And then this is the Neo, or the New Sumerian, or Old Babylonian way of writing that same token piece. The Neo-Assyrian way of writing it, the Neo, or New Babylonian way of writing it. And basically it means sheep. So if you went back far enough in time, people basically would be exchanging tokens when talking about exchanging goods. But eventually, maybe it became too difficult to carry tokens, or they became too heavy, and it became more simple to actually write it down. But again, across each of these, you can see the evolution of writing take place over time. It's pretty interesting. Okay, as I said, there was some literature. And in fact, one of the most famous pieces of literature from the Mesopotamian world is the story of Gilgamesh. It's a great story. It's sort of an adventure, story of friendship, two friends overcoming obstacles. But also in this story is the story of a great flood that's sent by an angry god. So it's an interesting story because it really does sort of sound like the story of Noah's Ark. So most people in the Judeo-Christian world are very familiar with the story of Noah's Ark because it's an Old Testament story. But that story actually is predated in the story of Gilgamesh. It's a very, very similar story. So there may be some connection between, again, ancient Mesopotamian beliefs and also with what comes up later on in both Judaism and Christianity. Okay, let's take a look at our last characteristic, and that's social classes. So if I take a look at this, we know at the top we would have had a ruling family, the kings, the leading officials who ran the government, the well-organized central government below them, the high priests who would have been responsible for religion and most likely reading, and then the warriors who defended all of these folks. Okay, and the next group would have been merchants, artisans, maybe some of the lesser priests and the scribes who did most of the record keeping and the writing and reading as opposed to the higher level religious interpretation stuff. And then at the bottom we would have had peasant farmers and maybe slaves. So this social class would have been very typical of what you would have found in the Mesopotamian world.